Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to SmartLogic's webinar, Semaphore Knowledge Modeling with the Accidental Taxonomist. My name is Ann Kelly, and I have two great speakers here with me today. Heather Hedden, Senior Vocabulary Editor at Gale, a Cengage company, and Jim Morris, a Senior Information Science Consultant here at SmartLogic. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is in broadcast mode, so all of you are muted. Please put your questions in the GoToWebinar panel, which you'll see at the right hand of the side of your screen. We'll get to as many of them as we can in the Q&A session. And finally, this broadcast is being recorded and replay information will be sent to all registrants following the broadcast. We have about 45 minutes worth of content, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Heather.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. I'm Heather Hedden. A very brief introduction. I'm a Senior Vocabulary Editor at Gale, a Cengage company, which is actually a partner of SmartLogic. I've worked before as a taxonomy consultant, and tying in with the title of this webinar, I wrote the book, The Accidental Taxonomist. Now it's its second edition. And I also teach online courses in taxonomy creation if you'd like to learn more. This is our agenda. We're going to talk about knowledge models, concepts and labels, relationships, and briefly concept classes with demos of Semaphore interspersed. So what's a knowledge model? I hadn't thought about this too much before because I've written a lot about taxonomies, not knowledge models, and it's a little bit more complex than other control vocabularies. It could be a thesaurus or an ontology, maybe a taxonomy, depending on how we define a taxonomy, because there are different definitions. It would be perhaps a set of hierarchies, not just a single one. Or it could be even another kind of knowledge organization system. So I would think a knowledge model comprises concepts, their labels, any other kind of metadata or attributes of concepts, their relationships, and also their rules for usage. And they're used to tag, classify, index content repository. So one knowledge model goes with one set of content so that users can find or discover information within that content. I've talked before about controlled vocabularies. A knowledge organization system is sometimes another way of talking about controlled vocabularies, but it's as a system, I think a knowledge model is more similar to a knowledge organization system. As I said, it's not the same as a controlled vocabulary, which could be simpler. Perhaps you've seen this chart listing different kinds of controlled vocabularies from the simplest, just a simple term list, to the most complex, an ontology. So a knowledge model could be, as I've boxed around here in blue, a thesaurus or ontology, or maybe a taxonomy, as I have dashed lines here, not just one single hierarchy, but a set, or such as a faceted type of taxonomy, which has multiple controlled vocabularies, not just a single one. So you get the idea. It's all the vocabularies needed in combination for managing content and making it retrievable, not just a single list. So standards are important for knowledge models. There are two different kinds of standards. In a certain way, standards for specifications that allow interoperability, exchange of content, and standards for best practices design. So standards of specifications would include OWL, RDF, and SCOS, and a focus on SCOS. That stands for Simple Knowledge Organization System. It's a World Wide Web Consortium recommendation. You can get more information at this URL. And so knowledge models are often built in SCOS. And then standards for best practice design. There are two for thesauri particularly. The ISO standard, and the BS is British standard, it's the equivalent for thesauri, and the ANSI/NISO standard, that's American National Standards Institute and National Information Standards Organization. The two of them are compatible and overlap a lot. It's kind of, there's some scope. Of course, the ISO standard covers multilingual vocabularies where the ANSI/NISO does not. The only thing that I want to point out is the ANSI/NISO standard is free to download, so that's a good thing, where the other one you have to pay for. Okay, let's look more at knowledge models and what they comprise. They comprise concepts and relationships between concepts. Concepts then can be organized into groupings called concept schemes. So a concept scheme is essentially the same as a knowledge model. Concepts within a concept scheme might be assigned subgroupings or categories called concept classes. Concepts have various names or labels, and they may have additional descriptive values or metadata. And their relationships. This can be of standard, hierarchical, or associative types, which are described in the ISO and ANSI ISO standards, or you can customize them. So let's hear from Jim a little bit about how Semaphore models, knowledge models.
Thanks, Heather. Hi, everybody. Yes, this is Jim Morris. I'm an information scientist and solution architect at SmartLogic. And I am happy to be here in this webinar with Heather. As long as I've called myself a taxonomist, one of the many roles I've played over the years, Heather's been known as one of the most valuable experts. So it's I think we're really fortunate to have her here with us. So a little bit about Semaphore. Semaphore manages knowledge models. That's the heart of Semaphore. And we make it as simple as possible to do that, and allows you to conform to the best practice that Heather will be talking about, as well as ingest other types of taxonomies down to simple lists and synonym rings and other types of models. But we put those models to work in downstream applications, either through our auto classification or fact extraction engine, but also in exposing these models into downstream user interfaces to really enrich the experience or do more advanced analytics that depend on the knowledge model as well as the classified or extracted content. So with that, I'll take control and show you a little bit of Semaphore. So here you should be seeing my desktop with, this is the main Semaphore workbench. And you can see I can manage multiple models. These are models that are available to this particular user that I'm using. And you can see I have different rights to different models, so you can control who has access to models and what they can do with it. This user can only view some models, and whereas in other models they can edit and manage them. Let's look at one of these models. This is we casually call it the IPSV model. It's the Integrated Public Sector Vocabulary. It's a good broad thesaurus that can do some good basic classification of content. So we use it a lot for general purpose. And so once we go into the main screen for this model, we can this is where we control who has access. Maybe we link in other vocabularies. That's an important component of our architecture, and manage some workflow, which we'll talk about. I'll open up the master and we can actually look at one of these models. And we do follow the SCOS standard. The entire architecture is based on those W3C standards, including SCOS. So we have a set of concept schemes on the left, and as we drill into those, we can start to see the hierarchy represented. And if we click on one of these, we can see more information about each of the concepts, the labels and relationships, which we'll talk about more later. I also want to show you a quick other view of this. We can also show our models if you want to really expose your model to your to other users in your organization that may not be taxonomists or really wanted to be bothered with a lot of the options here. the ontology review tool is more of a visual way to browse a model and make suggestions and comments to a model. So it's a great way to socialize your vocabularies and taxonomies and get input from your users. One of the things I wanted to show you, just as another example of a model, is if we go back to our home screen, I have a couple different models here, and kind of at the other end of the extreme is this space missions model. This is are inspired by one of our first projects we did with NASA. And if we open this model up, we'll see there's a lot more information. We've linked in a geography vocabulary, which adds a lot of capability. But also, if we look at a concept like Apollo 11, kind of a named entity concept, we see a lot of labels, a lot of different types of relationships and so forth that we'll look at in more detail in the next section. So with that, just showing an overview of some different models that Semaphore can handle and how we use the standards to present that information. So I'll pass it back to Heather for more information about concepts and labels.
Okay, thanks. Yes, concepts and labels. You may hear of other names for things like terms, values, nodes, topics, descriptors, identifiers, individuals, instances. But I think it's best to call these concepts because the concept is an idea, that's something unique. It's an unambiguous entity in a knowledge model, which has a definition, whether it's actually spelled out or not, but it's known. So a concept could have multiple names or labels, and because we have synonyms, and they're also same word could refer to different concepts. So that's why we want to get away from words or terms and think of concepts. And it's the concept that's tagged or indexed or assigned to content items. And it's important that be clear to those on both sides, those who are involved with the tagging or uploading and managing of content, and those who are retrieving, what the concept means, that they have the same idea of what it means. So concepts then have labels. They should have a single preferred label in each language. That's what displays, especially if you have one of those visualizations or a hierarchical view where you can't also display at the same time any other variants or alternative labels. But concepts also have alternative labels to aid in helping people find the concept. They would match searches that people put into a search box. They could match other kind of automated indexing, but they don't display in other visualizations of the entire knowledge model. Let's look at some specific examples and best practices. When you need to create concepts and labels, you have to decide what you're going to use for the preferred label. They're often synonyms such as doctors and physicians, or movies and motion pictures, cars or automobiles. So how do you decide what should be the preferred label? It's best to consider your users, your audience. What will they call it, most likely? And then there are other factors to consider, but that would be the first one. Also, you might consider what any enterprise or organizational control vocabulary should use, or other professional standards. You also want to have a level of consistency of style throughout the knowledge model regarding how formal or scientific or more colloquial language. Then also consider the wording of documents or content to be indexed. This could vary though, because the content comes from different sources and different authors. And then a final point I recommend, if you have two synonyms that are very close and you're trying to decide, another factor is you want to be broad enough. So in this case, doctors is maybe slightly broader than physicians. And then you might choose that one. Okay, then what about the format and style of the labels for concepts? There are issues to consider, such as capitalization. Most commonly, we see in knowledge models an initial capitalization of the first letter of the first word only. All lowercase is a style that's sometimes used in book indexes. You could do that in a very large thesaurus, but I recommend against using title capitalization in this final corporate finance because that could be mistaken for a name such as a department. So this way it's clear to users what are proper nouns and what are not. Labels can be single words or multi-word phrases, and generally they are nouns or noun phrases. Adjectives alone, in certain circumstances, such as facets or attributes, you might have a list of colors, for example, and then colors are adjectives, and that's okay. Countable nouns are usually plural, and the reason for this is because a single concept is tagged to multiple content items. The idea is here you're going to find multiple things with this name, and therefore it would be plural. You might have parenthetical qualifiers to disambiguate between words of the same word with different meaning. And we should avoid inversions, noun, comma, adjective, and preferred labels at least, because that's not necessary. It should be just straight language, although you might see that in a printed index. But our content is digital now, and it can be searched. So preferred and alternative labels should follow the same style, but you might have some particular styles too, some other rules, and you should document your own internal style policies. SCOS format serves multilingual knowledge models very well because a concept has a single preferred label in each language and alternative labels in each language as well. And there would be a ISO 2-letter language code to indicate the language. Preferred labels should be exact translations of each other for a concept, but the alternative labels can vary because even then they aren't exact synonyms or equivalents, as we'll see a little later. So they may be some in one language, not in the other, and they don't have to be exact translations. So yeah, let's talk about alternative labels in a little more detail. Sometimes people just call them synonyms. They're approximately synonymous, but they're not just words, they're phrases for the same concept. But what's important, it's for the context of the knowledge model and the set of content. So what works as an alternative label in one knowledge model for a concept might not in a different knowledge model for the same concept. So the purpose of alternative labels is to capture different wordings of how different people might refer to or call the same concept. And these different people could be the difference between the person, the author of the content, and the end user who's reading the content, or the difference between someone who's manually indexing the content, and again, the end users, and finally, between different end users. You know, different people will call the same concept or think about how to call it with different ways. So we can call this multiple entry points as to enter into the knowledge model and retrieve content. And it enables consistent indexing or tagging. So here are some actual examples of alternative labels that are used in the Gale thesaurus. The preferred label is in black, and the alternative labels are in blue italics. And you can see how some have a few and some have a lot. The example here of the parenthetical qualifier, for example, movies, films is a synonym for movies, but there are other meanings of the word films, you know, and some scientific biology meaning. So that's why movies in parentheses is following it. And you see another concept here, piano music has no alternative labels. Doesn't need any. That's exactly what it means. So there are plenty of concepts that don't require alternative labels. On the whole, generally most knowledge models have alternative labels only if it's a very small browsable taxonomy. So it's not really an entire knowledge model, but maybe a particular concept scheme within it, where all that can be seen and scrolled to and the user can see it all. For example, what's in a single facet of a faceted taxonomy, and where the tagging is manual, because the alternative labels support automated tagging or auto-indexing. So if the knowledge model is too large or to be seen in one view with minimal scrolling, if the knowledge model is to be searched upon and not just browsed, if automated indexing or auto classification is implemented, then these are all reasons to have alternative labels. And it doesn't matter whether you're calling it a taxonomy or thesaurus. I mean, you might have read that a taxonomy doesn't have to have alternative labels and a thesaurus does, but don't worry about what it's called, because there's a blurring between taxonomies and thesauri. It's more what these conditions call out for. More guidelines. So a concept may have any number of alternative labels, one or none. The alternative label, a specific alternative label, a word or phrase, is associated only with a single concept, points to one preferred label. You can't have this reuse alternative labels in different concepts. And in implementations, alternative labels may or may not be displayed to the end user, and they may or may not redirect to a preferred label. They could take the user directly to the content, depending on how you want to design your interface. Sources for alternative labels, as for preferred labels or concepts, involves looking at content and talking with people, but also of particular use for alternative labels are the search query logs, if you have any. If you already have some search on your content and users have entered some things into the search box, you could get a log and a list of what those search terms were, then those can often contribute to the alternative labels. External sources could also be consulted. And then there's the issue of just being more creative, thinking of synonyms, especially for a multi-word phrase. You can swap out synonyms for different words. But if you do this, you still should verify that your creative alternative label is actually used and occurs within the content repository. Finally, just to look at the variations, it's not just synonyms, all the different kinds of alternative labels that you could have. I'm going to read through the whole list. You can see it goes way beyond synonyms. It's what's equivalent within the context and the content. Even antonyms like flexibility, rigidity, they're just flip sides of the same issue. I just want to point out that a narrower concept could be function as an alternative label, because it points to, says use, genetic engineering, could redirect to biotechnology. But if you do that, it is a good idea to then actually display to the end user this relationship so that they know why they are retrieving a larger content set than what they're looking for. So that the next topic here is still on concepts and labels, is the metadata or other information about concepts. Most commonly, we use notes, and there are different kinds of notes. The standard type of note from thesauri is called a scope note, which kind of explains the scope of a concept, how it should be used. It's not a dictionary definition. And actually, I would advise against trying to add definitions to every concept. It's not very practical, and then you have to worry about inventing new definitions that are not from some copyright source, and just takes a lot of time, and it's not necessary. I would say add a scope note if you think there's some ambiguity about usage or if that has been indicated. There are other kinds of metadata besides notes. Concepts may have other attributes, and this could be also managed as a controlled list or free text. This is especially the case for those that are named entities, not so much for subjects. So here's some examples. If you have a concept scheme of companies, you may want to have information on them, data about their address, industry code, so forth. Person names could deal, especially if it's employees, their title and occupation. Products, there's a lot of data that could be added there about price and part number. And places, I've seen vocabularies that include latitude and longitude that you can look up. So this brings us now to our next demo. We'll see how the concepts and labels are put into action. Ready to go, Jim?
I'm ready to go. Thank you, Heather. I should be sharing my screen now. And
yep.
Yeah, that's a great session because Semaphore cares a lot about labels. As we said in the beginning, Semaphore puts models to work for classification and enrichment of user experiences. And when we're trying to identify what a topic, what a content is about, what a piece of text is about, you know, how do concepts appear in text? Well, they're labeled. So we do a lot with labels, and it's one of the reasons why we use the SCOS XL version of SCOS, because the XL stands for extension for labels, so it allows us to do a lot more with labels. So let me show you some of that. We're going to go back into our IPSV model. Since I'm going to be making some changes here, I'm going to use a task, and that means that's the way I can make changes to the model without affecting the master. And that's an important workflow tool to keep the integrity of your model in check. So I'm going to just put something here. And now I have a task specifically for this demonstration. So again, we have our concept schemes, we have our concepts in those schemes. And if we narrow down to a particular concept here, I'm going to go to employee rights. And you can see we have a couple labels. We have a preferred label, 3 alternate labels. And I just want to show how Semaphore can help, but just some of it just by using the standard. So for example, the standard restrictions that the SCOS model puts into place, Semaphore adopts. Like for example, if I wanted to add the French translation of this term, and SmartLogic CTO is French, so I verified that this was a decent French translation of employment rights, not just Google Translate. And let's just hit OK and see what happens here. Well, it's going to warn us because I forgot to set the language tag. So it says, remember that you can only have one pref label in each language. So if I change this to French, it'll accept it. So now I have 2 preferred labels, 1 in each language. And I can set the same language codes at the alternate label stage. Now I also control the integrity of, whether I can add the same alternate label that's a pref label. So if I tried to add the same label again, it would warn me. But in this case, we give the option to override, because in some cases you might have a special alternate label type for a department or system or something that you just need to be able to know what are all the right labels for a particular system or community. And in which case you might have a special label type just for them. And the label might be identical, and that is a use case that we see. So I could save that anyway in this case. So some options there. And you can create your own constraints. So if you had restrictions about whether terms should have dashes or special characters, things like that, you can have special constraints designed to help with that. So just to reiterate that, we have different types of labels. So you can just use the generic alternate label, or you could make them very specific. You could have one for acronyms, one for different downstream uses. We'll see more of those in the other model that we'll look at in a bit. Now, in terms of finding new alternate labels, there's a lot of ways to do that. You can text mine your content to look for the strings of noun phrases and so forth that show up a lot, and Semaphore can help you do that. We also have within the Knowledge Manager itself this idea of a side panel, and you can put anything here that you can think of, but we have a couple that we provide, including this one, which goes out and it's a clustering of terminology across many different public sources, and it just helps give you some ideas of what some good alternate labels might be. But it doesn't automatically add them, because you can see what happens when you just trust, clustering and just whatever happens to be out there in the world. There's things here that might be really useful. Labor law, if we want to put that as a type of alternate label, maybe not a synonym, but something that might point to employment rights. But you could select some of these and add those as types of alternate labels. Maybe these should be like a used for label, meaning they're not really synonymous. They're just, if we see these in text, use employment rights, for example. Some more about labels. We can, because I said how much we care about labels, we have special properties for labels. So suppose, one of these terms, you don't want it, you only want it to be used when you're classifying content if terms appear exactly like this. So you can say things like, for a particular label, make sure that it treats it as an exact phrase only. So exactly like that, because by default, Semaphore will look for the terms in different orders or in different proximity to each other, the words in the label itself. So there's a lot of controls here, and you can design your own for these as well. Case sensitivity is important. If it's a proper noun that can be easily confused with other terms. So a lot of capabilities there. The last thing I wanted to show you here, we'll look at metadata notes in the next session with the other model. But I wanted to quick show you how we put this to work as an example. So if we were to publish this model so that we could use it for content classification. So imagine you're a content owner, or you've just edited a document and you're trying to load it into your SharePoint or Sitecore or some content management system, and you're told that you need to apply subject headings. Well, Semaphore can assist with that. So if I select a document I have here, and say I'm loading this document up into my content management system, you can call Semaphore, and Semaphore has returned a set of concepts. I'll do that again real quickly. It looks like it maybe have timed out. So you can see the concepts that it applied. It also extracted some entities, which is a different topic. But here these are the concepts from our model that we were just looking at, that Semaphore believes are relevant to this content. And we could add our own as well. If we just started typing, Semaphore can bring you into the model itself and allow you to select terms that might be, that you believe are relevant that maybe Semaphore didn't find. You can also request additional tags that get fed back into the model as a candidate concept for review by the manager of the model. So just a quick view as to how we put these labels to work in your downstream systems. So yeah, so we care a lot about labels, and how you use them and how you design them really depends on your audience, the purpose of the knowledge model, whether they're searchers, indexers, content owners, editors, etc. So with that, I will hand it back to Heather for the last section on relationships and classes.
Okay. Yes. The relationships between concepts, there are different kinds. hierarchical, between a broader and narrower, associative, which means just related in any way, and then you can also customize your relationships, which should be based on a hierarchical or associative type. And it's important to understand that relationships are reciprocal between concepts. They go in both directions. You can start with either. We might speak of broader concept, narrower concept, related concepts, but it's important to understand that these are actually not types of concepts. They are types of relationships. And it's only with respect to another concept that something is broader or narrower. So it's more accurate to say has broader concept, has narrower concept, or has related concept. Okay, hierarchical relationship, broader, narrower, generic, specific, topic, subtopic, maybe sometimes parent-child, it could be called. This is a required feature of most knowledge models. It's a required feature of taxonomies and thesauri. And in this type of structure, often a concept has multiple narrower concept relationships and just one broader concept relationship, unless of course it's the most specific in the vocabulary, in the concept scheme. On occasion, a concept may have more than one broader concept relationship, and this is referred to as a polyhierarchy. It's important to create the hierarchical relationship in a sound, valid manner. This is explained in the ISO and ANSI ISO standards. You think that this way that a broader concept includes the narrower concept, and so if you go from broader to narrower, but some of a broader is narrower and all of a narrower is broader. Well, let's look at the example. Following the arrows, some fruits are oranges, all oranges are fruits. And then if we spell out the relationship, fruits has narrower concept, oranges has broader concept, fruits. According to the standards, there are actually 3 subtypes: generic, specific, of which this is an example, a generic instance, the named entity from a common noun to proper noun, and the whole part. More on the generic specific, you can think of some grouping, category, a class, and its members, and more specific types. And in this case, the way to kind of test it, as you thinking, can I create a relationship that's hierarchical between these 2 concepts? You put it as the narrow concept is or are a kind of broader concept. So in this case, as puppies has broader dogs, puppies are a kind of dog. Yeah, that works. That makes sense. So that's valid. So has broader is the same as is or are a kind of. And similarly, the common noun, proper noun, it's not, it's a kind of, it is. So Samsung Galaxy is a smartphone. Has broader is a. I just want to mention that we don't see this kind of generic instance relationship constructed quite as often, because often in a knowledge model, a separate concept scheme will be created for each of the named entity types, like one concept scheme for products and a different one for product categories. But you can still have relationships across concept schemes as well. And you might even customize them. So if you want something to display hierarchically, then you would create these relationships. And then the whole part. In this case, some concept or entity and its parts or sub-entities. And this time to test it, instead of saying is a kind of, you say it's in. So French Alps are in France. That makes sense. And it must be an integral part that cannot be taken out. An example I've given before is, for example, a bed is in a bedroom, but it is incorrect to say bed has broader concept bedroom. Bed has broader concept furniture, it's a kind of furniture, but it can be taken out of the bedroom and put somewhere else. So it's not an integral part. That is not a whole part hierarchical relationship. All right, then the associative relationship, related terms. These are suggestions to the user of possible related concepts of interest. It's a little more subjective to create. You have to think, is this useful and not too much? Think about also the see also cross-reference in the back of the book index. Associative relations are common in many knowledge models. It's required of thesauri. It's a defining feature of thesauri and may or may not be in taxonomies. It's bidirectional, but also symmetrical. It's the same in both directions. Unlike has broader, has narrower, it's just has related in both directions. It can be between concepts in the same hierarchy or different hierarchies. We've seen this example in the same hierarchy, especially sharing the same broader concept. If two concepts have the same broader concept, but they have overlapping meaning, here I say they're siblings because they have the same parent, then it is, the standards recommend that you create the relationship. There's a lot of overlap between local taxes and property taxes because most local taxes are property taxes and most property taxes are local, but not all. So this is a good candidate for pointing out to the user that these are related concepts. If two concepts have the same broader concept, siblings, but there isn't any overlapping meaning, while not technically incorrect, it is advised not to create an associative relationship between them. It just kind of, it's too obvious, it gets in the way, there's no need for that. So laptops and tablets, at least for now, since they haven't converged yet, and they don't overlap, are not associative and don't have the related concept relationship. And then finally, associative relationships between concepts in different hierarchies. We can see this between civil engineering and civil engineers. They have different broader concepts and so forth, but there's obviously a relationship between them, and it's good to point out to the user that the other concept exists, especially if, even if they were browsing, if they were searching, they may or may not find it. If they were browsing hierarchically, they'd be browsing different hierarchies and not even notice. So this is a useful implementation of associative relationships. And then specific customized relationships. These can also be called semantic. The word semantic means has meaning. So the additional meaning is assigned. It's not just they're related. How are they related? This relationship is reciprocal, but it's asymmetrical. It's different in each direction. It's not just has related. And then they need to be specific enough to convey the necessary meaning, but of course not uniquely specific. These relationships would apply to a whole class of terms, which then brings up the next issue of concept classes. You would designate a class of concepts that has a certain relationship between another, and that's what the taxonomist or knowledge modeler does. I'll show an example on the next page. And customized relationships are a defining characteristic of ontologies, but you don't have to follow everything to make an ontology to decide you might need a few customized relationships. Here are some examples between an author and his published work. So Mark Twain has the work of Adventures of Tom Sawyer. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer has the creator of Mark Twain. You might sometimes have to think of, again, has in front of a company and its product. Apple has a product, iPod has a manufacturer, Apple. And I've made up these relationships, but they are based on the associative, and they have to be reciprocal. So this is a task of knowledge modeling as well. And I mentioned concept classes. That's a requirement if you do have customized relationships, because you set it up between the different classes, the classes of people and works, between products and companies, between products and, in the case of drugs, a disease they treat. And yes, okay, but concept classes aren't just used when you have semantic relationships and ontologies. You could set up concept classes for other purposes, even in traditional taxonomies or thesauri. For example, you want to designate that certain concepts are being used in certain implementations for certain audiences, internal, external, in the intranet versus a public website, or different websites on different user interface displays. Or it may also be something to control or manage the different metadata field requirements that can vary for different kinds of concepts. That brings the end of my presentation. Let's see another demo of Semaphore with relationships.
Thanks, Heather. I'm going to go back to my Semaphore workbench screen. Here we're seeing our models. So yeah, I have a couple examples where we manage models that deal with hierarchies a little differently. For example, I wanted to point out the human disease ontology. This is a very, very well managed ontology. It is strictly an ontology of human diseases. And I'm not a biologist, but from friends that I know that are, this is a very valuable, publicly managed, collaboratively managed ontology. And so it's very well controlled, and it's very strictly a what Heather described as a generic specific type of ontology. It's really a class hierarchy in the strict ontology sense. So that every disease in the tree or every concept in this particular tree inherits the characteristics of the parent. And in this particular model, we have a lot of rich information about specific disease definitions, cross-references, and so forth. For another example, let's look at, we have a geography concepts model. This is one where we can only view it. But in this case, it is more of a kind of a whole part example, right? Because these are continents have countries, countries have cities. They're different classes, but they fit into a hierarchy of that nature, like a whole part. And this is a great vocabulary to reuse in other types of contexts. So let's go back to our other model, the space missions model that we saw earlier, because it has a lot of rich information in it. Some might even say it's a little convoluted in its complexity. But this is more of a kind of a generic instance vocabulary in most cases, where we have, it's a lot of proper nouns. And you think of the purpose of this, it was to help to classify, originally, the original version of this, to classify engineering documents for the space mission. So we had to know, how do we classify information that's about a particular topic? So in this case, these pieces of equipment and missions, like Apollo 11 is a mission within the Apollo space program. But just to look at some of the relationships here, other than the broader, narrower relationships, we have related concepts on the right, and you can see we have, in some cases, there's a straight related concept without any being more specific. But in this case, we've made all of these very specific. It's sometimes helpful to look at this visually, as we did before. So Apollo 11 has a spacecraft. It landed somewhere. It was launched by something. It was launched from a particular site. So these are all very specific relationships that are only valid between particular classes of concepts. So we'll talk about that in a second. But like, for example, we can navigate that from Apollo 11 to where it was launched from, the Kennedy Space Center. And from there, we can see, well, a lot of things were launched from the Kennedy Space Center. And it's also located in Florida. So that's interesting. So Florida is not actually part of this model. It's a model that I've linked in. So this model is actually managed by a different community, but I'm able to reuse it here in my space missions model. And I can see the metadata. Heather mentioned, like latitude and longitude as good properties for your geographic concepts. We have those here, so they can all be used. And the classes very quickly, the relationships between these is controlled by classes. So in our structure, you can set all that up and say that it's only certain relationships are only valid for certain concepts. And that's all controlled within the structure. The last thing I wanted to show you before we wrap up is the use of this model in a downstream application. So for example, in a search application, it's a good place where exposing the model can really help people find the content or navigate the content that they're looking for. And we've shut down there. So for example, if I'm searching for something like Apollo 11, I can quickly go in and find what concept that stands for, because Eagle was a shorthand for that. Or I'm looking for Dr. Rendezvous, or Dr. Rendezvous is Buzz Aldrin, so I can quickly go in here. But then, so I'm in my search interface, I found some documents. But look at this blue box. I'm exposing information from the model to my users. So now I can go back to Apollo 11, and I can see information Apollo 11 without even looking at my results. I can learn about these concepts by exposing those relationships we were just looking at in the user's experience. So I can navigate content by the structure of the ontology. So it's a really cool way to make use of your vocabularies. And that's pretty much it. So that's it for me. So I hope you learned a bit about Semaphore's role in applying best practice and putting models, that best practice to work in downstream systems. And even if you don't follow best practice, we can put them to work. But you don't. You can't ever underestimate the value of a well built and thought through thesaurus or taxonomy. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Heather and Jim. It's great information, great conversation. We do have about 8 minutes here to go through some of our questions. I'm going to start with, there's a couple questions which I'll just handle. Yes, we will send out the replay. It should go out in the next day or so, and you will get a link to the slides. So that has handled a number of my questions. Here's an interesting question. What should dictate using a concept scheme or a different top-level node? And I'm gonna.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that comes to me.
That comes to you.
Yeah. Sometimes, yeah, I've actually wrote a blog a post on this, like with one or more taxonomies. Again, I'm using the word taxonomy instead of concept scheme. But yeah, when is it one and when is it multiple? And that is something I thought about. I think that if you can support standard generic relationships, broader, narrower, and related within, but then it's typically when you have semantic customized relationships when you go out to another one. That was one of the issues I remember thinking. Because often you would have like named entities separate, but they don't absolutely have to be. They could be included within. So whether you include your named entities within the same concept scheme or not really depends on how you want that implemented, manifested in some user interface. And often it's easier for end users to have those separate. So I hope that answers it, at least partially.
Okay, yeah, I think it did. Okay, here's another one. Thanks, that was a good demo. We'll give you a little kudos, Jim. Is there an automatic way to ingest and tag the content, or do you have to do it manually? And I think, Jim, that would be you.
Yeah, for referring to the case where I loaded a document in and Semaphore classified it. Yeah, that was just one workflow. That's one typical workflow that would be supported. But certainly, if you're crawling your intranet content to be indexed for a search engine, you're classifying in bulk. So you would have a pipeline that would get each document sent to Semaphore. Semaphore would classify it. You can also, classify across an entire, file directory or something like that, and both classify it, maybe extract some particular entities that you're looking for. So yeah, basically, yeah, certainly not. It's not just one at a time.
Okay, good, thank you. Here's another good one. Are there organizations that offer base taxonomies that can be used to kickstart the model development process? I'm going to turn that to Heather first.
Yeah, they are. I mean, you can look them up in directories or registries of knowledge models, control vocabularies, knowledge organization systems, such as Taxonomy Warehouse and Bartok, that's BARTOC. Actually, my employer, Gale, does license out its subsets of its subject thesaurus. It's kind of a lesser known thing because, they're a library publisher, but could look into that as well.
Okay. Let me see. Here's another one. I'm going to say this is probably for you, Jim. Hi, do you have a way to batch load the content for these properties?
I guess there could be two interpretations of that. One is when loading documents for classification using the taxonomies. As we said before, that doesn't have to be one at a time. That can certainly be in batch. It really depends on where your content is going and how you want to process it. In terms of the taxonomy itself, something we really didn't talk much about was how would you load a taxonomy that was managed somewhere else, maybe in spreadsheets or some other system. Semaphore has several utilities for that, including a spreadsheet importer that you can use to develop your taxonomies beforehand and before it goes into Semaphore. And we support other import methods as well.
Okay, I'm looking. I think we have, I thought I saw a new one, but I am not seeing it. We had one. So there's an additional question. I'm not really sure. Maybe the author can. It says, does it support SCOS-XL? And I don't know if they mean, does Semaphore support SCOS-XL? So if that's your question, maybe you can.
For Semaphore, certainly we support SCOS-XL. I mean, very, very explicitly. That's how we're able to put all those special properties on a label saying, we want this particular label to be always treated as an exact phrase, or emphasize its weight in classification, those kinds of things. That's why we use SCOS-XL, so we can add those properties to labels.
I think we have time for one more question, and I think you both could probably speak to this. From a content management and decision management perspective, would you recommend establishing a dedicated team center of excellence to manage the ontology? And I'm going to let you take a hot shot at that first, Heather. What is your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, whether you call it a center of excellence, but it is a team. It's not just one person. And even some people, they might, they have other roles to be involved in. Well, this comes up as part of governance of a knowledge model and its use, which includes, as I mentioned, there was something about style policies, but how it's going how do you approve adding new concepts? Who decides that, and how's that done? And also the policies regarding tagging, which can change. So it is up to more than just a single knowledge modeler or taxonomist. There are other stakeholders who are involved too. It will depend on the different organizations, but it should include multiple people. Let's see what you have to say, Jim.
Jim, any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. It's I think in most cases that we've seen in projects, there's maybe a federated governance model where there's people representing different parts of an organization that can contribute to a model, facilitating, and different people, you saw how Semaphore can support different models for different users. So you could have different people managing their parts of an enterprise model, for example, and then you could link them together to present an enterprise view. Now, you have to kind of manage, if they're all following their own rules, well, then that joined up taxonomy may not work as effectively as you expect. So you should have some type of governance guidelines and process for doing that, and really try to make it easy as possible for your users to be involved in the process. Just putting out a governance document saying this is how you should do things doesn't always work. You have to make it compelling for people to contribute, show the value of managing of what their involvement in the taxonomy makes.
Okay, well, we're out of time, and so I want to thank both Heather and Jim, and thanks everyone for joining us today, and keep a lookout for the webinar replay. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.